Hello, New Covenant Parish. Glad to be back with you looking at another lectionary text this week. And today we'll spend a few minutes thinking about a reading from one of Paul's letters, 1 Thessalonians 2, 1 through 8. To get the context of this reading, you might want to go back and read the first chapter as well. And when you do, you'll see that Paul continues remembering the ministry he and his co-workers had with and among the Christians at Thessalonica. First, with much thanks, he remembers the reception they gave him and the gospel. And now he begins to talk about the nature of the work he did with them. Now, I think it's important to remember, too, that this is probably the earliest letter Paul wrote that we have in the Bible. He could have wrote other ones, but this is the earliest one we know of that made it into the Bible. And notice in the introduction that Paul doesn't begin by identifying himself as an apostle. Now, he does this a lot in his later letters. I mean, check out Romans. There's a long description there he writes. But right here, there's none of that. He seems to be simply describing the work of an apostle of Jesus. It could be he's still trying to figure out exactly what it means to be called apostles of Christ, as he says in verse 7, which for me makes this letter even more fascinating to study. And at this point, early in his ministry, Paul's understanding of apostleship is seen to require three things, three characteristics. First, to be an apostle, you must have the courage needed to proclaim the gospel. He says in verse 2, we had courage in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in spite of great opposition. Now, of course, right before this, he mentions what he'd suffered at Philippi. You read about that in Acts 16. He and Silas got beat up pretty bad there. So you might think he's talking about courage to face the worst kind of adversity. But you know, really, any proclamation of the gospel takes courage, because the gospel can really rub some people the wrong way. It can. I mean, they hear it as a threat to their life and freedom, something that's trying to rock their boat. And if their boat needs rocking, it can sure do that. And the messenger won't always be warmly received for bringing the message to them. And Paul's not talking about natural human courage here. He says the apostles have courage in our God. They receive it as a gift from God, empowering them to do the work. You might take a minute to look at the account in Acts 4, where the little Christian community in Jerusalem prays together for boldness to speak the gospel in the face of threats from the authorities all over them. It takes courage to say things folks don't want to hear. And there are times and places where it takes a lot of courage to proclaim the gospel. Always has been, always will be. A second characteristic of an apostle is integrity. In verses 3 through 6, Paul talks about this. He writes that the apostles acted without deceit, impure motives, or trickery. They didn't use words of flattery. They didn't have a pretext for greed. And this is because their task was one of pleasing God rather than human beings. See, the apostle is not allowed to tell people what they want to hear in an attempt to win their consent or gain their support. They can only say what God has authorized them to say, clearly and honestly, with integrity and respect for God and the gospel message. And the third characteristic of the apostle has to do with the kind of relationship the apostle shares with the people they minister to. And Paul went over this early in the first chapter, but he comes back to it now using very vivid imagery about the attitudes and roles Paul and his co-workers played as they related to the Thessalonians. In verse 7, he says they treated the Thessalonians like they were a nurse caring for young children. And outside our reading in verse 11, they talk about encouraging the Thessalonians like a father would his children. And you look at verse 7 where it says, we were gentle among you. Well, there are other ancient manuscripts. There's a lot of ancient manuscripts that complement the Bible, don't make it into many of the translations. But this one, you can translate the text as, we were infants among you. Not we were gentle among you, but we were infants among you. Look for that in the notes of your Bible. Most translations report it. Think about the picture Paul is painting here of how an apostle relates to others. The apostle is as weak and unprotected as an infant, as gentle as a mother with her infant, as protective as a father to his child. So you hear what he's saying. An apostle, which means a messenger, someone sent with a message, An apostle of the gospel is an absolutely vulnerable figure. I mean, forget the image of an authoritative, charismatic, big shot preacher, teacher in the church speaking to big crowds and television audiences. That's not the picture here. No. An apostle is one who enters into deep, trusting, personal relationships with others with an absolutely unguarded heart. I mean, willing to risk rejection, maybe even humiliation, that the truth of the gospel may be shared with others. Given all this, it's no surprise that he ends this passage by saying that they were determined not only to share the gospel of God, but also our own selves with you. There's something else to note here. In nurturing these kinds of relationships with a group of Christian believers, Paul doesn't say anything about success being measured in terms of the number of people gathered or financial security accumulated and acquired or influence in the world achieved. At the beginning of this reading, he simply says, our coming to you was not in vain. We need to remember this, folks, that in our small church families, as we gather together in the spirit of the gospel and honestly, with integrity, share with one another the love of Jesus Christ, as we do this, our coming together, our laboring together in gospel ministry, it is never in vain. Not in vain. God notes it, and God is pleased by it, what we do here together as a family of faith. So, thanks be to God for all we have shared, and all by His grace we continue to share here in New Covenant Parish. God bless you, my friends. See you soon.